Room 109 in the Shelby Center for Science and Technology was the epitome of academic safety. It was a Friday afternoon, February 12, 2010. 13 biologists sat around a U-shaped table, casually debating department budgets. The air was thick with the mundane drone of university bureaucracy. Then, the drone abruptly stopped. A Harvard-educated neurobiologist stood up from her chair. She offered no warnings. She simply raised a 9mm handgun and began methodically executing her colleagues. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Dr. Amy Bishop arrived in the Deep South carrying an invisible, heavy crown. When she accepted an assistant professor position at the University of Alabama in Huntsville in the fall of 2003, she didn't just bring her family and her research. She brought a resume that she wielded like a blunt instrument. A PhD in genetics from Harvard University. Years of prestigious postdoctoral work. To Bishop, these credentials were not merely academic achievements. They were indisputable proof of her intrinsic superiority. Huntsville is a recognized intellectual hub, heavily populated by aerospace engineers, defense contractors, and NASA scientists. Yet from the moment she stepped onto the UAH campus, Amy projected an air of absolute condescension. She was an academic from the elite Northeast. In her mind, she was slumming it. Raised in the middle-class suburb of Braintree, Massachusetts, her entire identity had been constructed around intellectual exceptionalism. Her family revered academic greatness, and Amy internalized this to a dangerous, obsessive degree. She didn't just want to participate in the scientific community, she demanded to dominate it. Her focus on neurobiology was intense, but her passion often seemed less about the pursuit of knowledge and more about the accolades that knowledge could bring. She craved the spotlight, the high-dollar grants, the publications in top-tier journals. She needed the world to recognize her as a generational genius. But the reality of Amy Bishop in the laboratory and the lecture hall was jarringly different from the genius she envisioned in her head. She was profoundly abrasive. Socially awkward to the point of overt hostility, she alienated her peers almost immediately. Interactions with her were described by colleagues as combative, disjointed, and exhausting. If someone questioned her methodologies, she didn't engage in standard academic debate. She registered it as a severe personal attack. She interrupted, she belittled, she demanded absolute deference. Graduate students found her erratic and her grading arbitrary. The entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She operated under the rigid, unshakable belief that the university owed her endless resources and unquestioned respect simply because she possessed a Harvard degree. This desperate need for validation manifested in a frantic push to invent something revolutionary. Amy became consumed with developing an automated, portable cell incubator, a device she designed alongside her husband, James Anderson. She pitched the incubator relentlessly, convinced it was a multi-million-dollar breakthrough that would fundamentally alter medical research. She poured her fragile ego into the machine, using it as a psychological shield against the creeping, quiet realization that her academic career was actually stalling. When investors or senior faculty pointed out mechanical flaws or showed lukewarm interest, she didn't recalibrate. She viewed their hesitation as a conspiracy of the mediocre, trying to suppress a visionary. Every rejection was meticulously cataloged in her mind, never as constructive feedback, but as a deep, malicious betrayal. Her husband James was her primary sounding board and her fiercest defender. They had met during their undergraduate years and built an insular life together, raising 4 children while navigating the grueling demands of academic research. But their dynamic was dangerously isolated. They fed off each other's grievances. When Amy felt slighted by the biology department, James validated her anger. Instead of grounding her in reality, her home life served as a tight echo chamber for her growing paranoia and resentment. As the years in Huntsville ticked by, the pressure cooker of the university system began to build toward critical mass. Assistant professors operate on a ticking clock. They are given a set number of years to publish extensively, secure outside funding, and prove their worth before the tenure committee decides their fate. Tenure means a lifetime appointment. Denial means termination. For Amy, achieving tenure was not just about job security. It was the ultimate mandatory validation of her genius. Without it, the entire narrative she had constructed about her own brilliance would shatter. She approached the looming tenure review, not with the quiet confidence of a seasoned scientist, but with a frantic, white-knuckled entitlement. The University of Alabama in Huntsville Biology Department was a tight-knit ecosystem. Housed primarily within the modern walls of the Shelby Center, the faculty operated on collaboration, mutual respect, and shared resources. It was a functional, quiet academic family. When Dr. Amy Bishop joined their ranks, she was an invasive species. She made it immediately clear that she viewed her colleagues as intellectual inferiors. While other professors kept open-door policies and engaged in casual discourse in the hallways, Bishop isolated herself. Her lab was her fortress. She operated under the assumption that her Harvard pedigree granted her immunity from the standard social and professional expectations of a junior faculty member. She openly scoffed at the research of her peers, dismissing their work as derivative while elevating her own to an unearned level of grandeur. At the center of this department was Dr. Gopi Podila, the chairman. Podila was universally beloved. He was a deeply empathetic leader who actively championed his junior faculty, offering them resources, guidance, and unwavering support. He was the kind of administrator who genuinely wanted his staff to succeed, but his management style relied on collegiality. He expected his professors to work together, to secure joint grants, and to treat the students with respect. Bishop viewed his collaborative approach as a weakness. Instead of seeing Podila as a mentor, she categorized him as a bureaucratic obstacle, someone whose primary function should be to fast-track her inevitable rise to scientific stardom. The friction extended far beyond the faculty lounge. In the lecture halls, her behavior was aggressively erratic. Students reported that her teaching style was disjointed, her grading rubrics nonsensical, and her temperament highly volatile. If a student asked a clarifying question, she often responded with biting sarcasm or outright hostility, interpreting simple academic inquiries as challenges to her intellect. Complaints began to pile up on Dr. Padilla's desk. The department attempted to guide her, offering constructive feedback to smooth her rough edges. Bishop rejected every critique. In her mind, the students were simply too slow to grasp her advanced concepts, and her colleagues were too mediocre to understand her methods. Everything hinged on the tenure review. In academia, the tenure track is an arduous, 6-year marathon. It is a grueling evaluation of a professor's published research, grant acquisition, and teaching efficacy. Earning tenure guarantees lifetime employment and academic freedom. Being denied means termination, a terminal contract granting one final year to pack up and find a new job. For Amy Bishop, the spring of 2009 was her judgment day. She submitted her dossier with the absolute certainty of a victor claiming her spoils. She leaned heavily on her automated cell incubator, touting it as a revolutionary breakthrough that would generate millions in revenue for the university. She listed her publications and her postdoctoral fellowships, fully expecting the committee to be dazzled. They were not. The tenure committee, comprised of senior faculty members, including Dr. Podila, meticulously reviewed her portfolio. The reality of her output was starkly different from her self-assessment. Her publication record was thin. Many of her papers were placed in lower-tier journals, and several were co-authored almost exclusively with her husband, raising concerns about her ability to conduct independent, high-level research. Her cell incubator, while interesting, had not secured the massive outside funding or peer validation she claimed it would. Furthermore, the stack of student complaints and her inability to function within a collaborative environment weighed heavily against her. In April 2009, the committee handed down its decision. Tenure was denied. The rejection did not spark introspection. It ignited a profound, consuming rage. For Bishop, the denial was not an assessment of her academic output. It was a targeted, malicious assassination of her character. The narrative she had built her entire life, the brilliant, untouchable Harvard genius, was being dismantled by a group of people she fundamentally despised. She refused to accept the decision. Bishop launched a frantic, aggressive appeals process. She treated the academic review like a hostile legal dispute, drafting lengthy, combative rebuttals. She accused the tenure committee of gross incompetence and deep-seated bias. Her husband James became her co-conspirator in this administrative war, helping her compile grievances and fueling her paranoia. At home, they constructed a narrative of victimhood. The university wasn't just blind to her genius, they were actively trying to destroy her out of pure jealousy. Her behavior on campus deteriorated rapidly. She began to view her colleagues not just as inferiors, but as active enemies. She fixated on Dr. Padilla, viewing the chairman as the orchestrator of her downfall. She also focused her resentment on Dr. Maria Ragland Davis and Dr. Adriel Johnson, two highly respected, successful faculty members who sat on the tenure committee. Bishop's interactions with them grew increasingly strained, marked by icy glares and barely suppressed hostility. Throughout the fall of 2009, the appeals wound their way through the university's administrative hierarchy. Every level of review upheld the biology department's initial decision. The provost reviewed it. The university president reviewed it. The outcome remained unchanged. Her terminal contract was set. The spring semester of 2010 would be her last. By January 2010, the reality of her impending termination settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had exhausted her appeals. She was a middle-aged academic with a tarnished reputation, a thin publication record, and a documented history of severe interpersonal conflicts. Finding another tenure-track position at a comparable institution would be nearly impossible. The career she felt entitled to was ending in disgrace. The desperation mutated into a cold, hardened resolve. The administration had delivered their final verdict, but Amy Bishop was not a woman who allowed others to have the last word. If they were going to systematically destroy her life's work, she would ensure they understood the exact magnitude of their mistake. The ticking clock of her contract was running out, and the pressure inside her isolated, paranoid world had finally breached its limits. February 12, 2010. A standard Friday in northern Alabama. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s, and a gray winter chill hung over the campus of the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Dr. Amy Bishop began her day with unnerving normalcy. She taught her morning anatomy and physiology class to a room full of undergraduates. Her students later noted nothing amiss. She was her usual abrasive, impatient self, pushing through the syllabus with a rigid, unyielding tempo. But beneath the academic facade, a lethal mechanism had already engaged. Weeks prior, the preparation had quietly begun. Bishop and her husband, James, had visited a local indoor firing range. She had familiarized herself with the weight, the recoil, and the slide mechanics of a 9mm Ruger pistol. She had practiced the mechanics of a lethal strike. Today, that exact weapon was fully loaded. She placed the heavy firearm inside an oversized tote bag, completely obscuring the metallic contour. She walked across the campus pathways, just another disgruntled employee seamlessly blending into the collegiate background. At 3 p.m., the biology department gathered for their scheduled faculty meeting inside the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Room 109 was a sterile, windowless environment. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The whiteboards were scarred with residual dry erase marker dust. A large U-shaped arrangement of tables filled the center of the room. 13 people filed in, taking their seats. Dr. Gopi Padilla took his usual place at the head of the table, preparing to lead a dry discussion on curriculum changes and spring budget allocations. Around the tables sat the intellectual core of the department. Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, Dr. Adriel Johnson, Dr. Joseph Leahy, Dr. Luis Cruz Vera, Dr. Deborah Moriarty. Staff assistant Stephanie Monticello sat nearby, notebook flipped open. Amy Bishop entered quietly. She did not take a seat in the back to avoid attention. Instead, she selected a chair near the front, right beside the only exit. She effectively and intentionally barricaded the room with her own presence. The meeting commenced. For nearly 40 minutes, the air in room 109 was thick with the soporific drone of university administration. Padilla discussed the upcoming semester. Colleagues politely debated minor policy adjustments. Bishop remained entirely silent. She sat forward, her hands resting near her bag. Those who casually glanced her way later realized she was intensely focused, but not on the meeting's agenda. Her eyes systematically tracked the room. She was mapping the spatial coordinates of her colleagues. There was no sudden argument, no flare-up of temper. The complete lack of an immediate trigger is what makes the ensuing violence so difficult to process. The meeting was simply winding down. People were checking their watches, thinking about the weekend traffic. It was approximately 3:40 p.m. The transition from administrative boredom to absolute carnage took less than 3 seconds. High-tension pacing. Bishop stood up. She did not yell. She offered no manifesto. She delivered no final words of grievance. She simply drew the 9mm Ruger. She leveled it at the head of Dr. Gopi Padilla. She pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot in the enclosed, concrete-walled room was deafening. Padilla collapsed instantly. The chairman, the man who had repeatedly tried to mentor her, was dead. Bishop pivoted. Her movements were described by survivors as entirely robotic. Clinical. She found her next target, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis. Another shot, point blank. Davis fell to the floor. Bishop turned again. Dr. Adriel Johnson, a third shot, another fatal strike to the head. This was not indiscriminate firing. Bishop was executing a hit list. She was systematically eliminating the senior faculty members who had voted against her tenure. She bypassed the newer professors. She bypassed those who had abstained from the vote. She aimed exclusively for the heads of her perceived enemies. The precision was terrifying. 3 highly respected scientists were dead within seconds. She then turned her weapon on the rest of the room. She fired at Dr. Joseph Leahy, striking him squarely in the head. He went down, critically wounded but violently clinging to life. She fired at Stephanie Monticello. The assistant was struck in the face and collapsed against the furniture. She fired at Dr. Luis Cruz Vera, hitting him deep in the chest. The sterile academic bubble ruptured. Disbelief morphed into visceral chaos. The sharp smell of cordite, sulfur, and copper flooded the confined space. Chairs flipped backward as professors dove for the linoleum floor. Some scrambled beneath the tables, pressing themselves flat against the tile. There was nowhere to run. Bishop was standing between the survivors and the hallway. She stood over her bleeding colleagues, the gun still raised, sweeping the room for her next target. She leveled the weapon at Dr. Deborah Moriarty. Moriarty was a friend. She was one of the very few people on campus who had consistently tried to support and defend Bishop. Bishop pulled the trigger. Click, the gun jammed, or the magazine was empty. The sudden mechanical failure broke the executioner's trance. Moriarty, operating on pure, unfiltered adrenaline, lunged forward from beneath the table. She crawled rapidly across the blood-slicked floor, grabbed Bishop by the legs, and desperately pleaded with her to stop. Bishop looked down, her expression utterly vacant. She attempted to clear the chamber, manually racking the slide to chamber another round. Moriarty did not wait for the weapon to clear. She pushed upward, shoving Bishop backward toward the threshold of the door. The aggressive physical contact forced the shooter out into the hallway. As soon as Bishop stumbled backward into the corridor, Moriarty slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The survivors immediately shoved a table against the frame, barricading themselves inside the slaughterhouse. The silence that followed was agonizing. Blood pooled on the linoleum, spreading rapidly beneath the U-shaped tables. The uninjured desperately ripped off articles of clothing, applying makeshift tourniquets and frantic pressure to the catastrophic wounds of Leahy, Cruz Vera, and Monticello. Someone pulled a cell phone with trembling hands and dialed the police. The dispatcher received the emergency call at exactly 3:48 p.m. Out in the corridor, Bishop made no attempt to force her way back inside. Her primary mission was complete. The architects of her academic failure had been punished. She walked away from the biology department with a terrifyingly calm stride. She entered a nearby women's restroom on the 2nd floor. She washed her hands in the sink. She dumped the 9mm Ruger in a metal trash can. Then, she pulled out her cell phone. She dialed her husband, James. She told him the faculty meeting was over. She calmly stated that she needed a ride home. The police response to the Shelby Center was overwhelming and immediate. Cruisers swarmed the campus perimeters. Tactical units breached the building, their assault rifles raised, expecting to hunt a heavily armed active shooter through a labyrinth of laboratories. Instead, they found a 45-year-old woman in unremarkable clothing, standing quietly near the exterior of the building. She was just waiting for her husband. Officers closed in, weapons drawn, demanding she get on the concrete. Bishop complied without a single struggle. There was no hostage situation, no frantic suicide attempt. As she was handcuffed and pulled up from the pavement, her face betrayed absolutely zero emotion. She looked around at the flashing red and blue lights, the screaming sirens, and the terrified students fleeing the building as if she were a minor inconvenience in an otherwise normal afternoon. As she was placed into the back of a squad car, an officer asked if she understood what was happening. She stared blankly through the plexiglass partition. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. A Harvard-educated neurobiologist had just committed a mass execution with the cold precision of a cartel hitman. The community of Huntsville was about to ask how a monster had infiltrated their ranks, but the deeper, far more terrifying question was about to surface. This was not the first time Amy Bishop had held a loaded gun, and it was certainly not the first time she had left a body in her wake. Huntsville detectives sat across from Amy Bishop in an aggressively lit, sterile interrogation room, searching for a microscopic fracture in her armor. They expected a breakdown. They anticipated tearful justifications about a ruined career, or perhaps a sudden, violent snap into manic remorse. What they got was an absolute chilling void. She sat with her hands folded. She requested a lawyer in a flat, monotone register. She stared at the institutional walls with eyes that registered zero comprehension of the slaughter she had just orchestrated. To the investigators, it was as if they were interrogating a piece of heavy, unfeeling machinery. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing was entirely regulated. By nightfall, the story of the Harvard-educated professor who executed her colleagues was dominating national news syndicates. The mugshot of Amy Bishop, disheveled, glaring, unapologetic, was plastered across television screens from coast to coast. The public grappled with the terrifying paradox of a suburban academic turning into a mass shooter, but 1,100 miles away, in the quiet, affluent suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, that broadcast triggered a visceral, sickening shockwave. Local journalists, retired police officers, and old neighbors in the town of Braintree stared at their screens, their blood turning to ice. They recognized that face. They knew that blank, terrifying stare. Huntsville investigators were desperately digging into her background, looking for a history of violence, a hidden criminal record, any red flags that could explain the carnage at the Shelby Center. On paper, her record was pristine, an untarnished academic climb. But then, the calls from Massachusetts began pouring into the precinct, completely shattering the illusion of the quirky, harmless scientist. The midpoint pivot of the investigation hit the detectives like a physical blow. Amy Bishop was not a first-time killer. The timeline violently shifted backward to December 6, 1986. The Bishop family home in Braintree was a pressure cooker of extreme expectations. Judy Bishop, Amy's mother, was a prominent, highly connected figure on the local town council. The children were pushed toward absolute excellence. Amy, then 21 years old, was intensely competitive and easily frustrated, but the golden child of the family was her 18-year-old brother, Seth. He was an accomplished violinist, widely well-liked and seemingly effortlessly successful. The underlying sibling rivalry was a quiet, toxic current humming beneath the floorboards of the household. That Saturday afternoon, Judy had just returned from a council meeting. Amy was upstairs in her bedroom with a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Her father had purchased it for home defense, a heavy, devastating piece of hardware that required deliberate, physical exertion to operate. Amy later claimed to investigators that she was trying to learn how to unload it. This was the narrative she constructed. The weapon was jammed. She walked downstairs to ask her mother for help, and it accidentally discharged. The physical mechanics of the incident completely defied her explanation. Amy entered the kitchen. Seth was standing near the counter. Amy raised the heavy, blued steel barrel of the 12-gauge. She claimed she was trying to safely eject a shell, but a pump-action shotgun does not simply slip. It requires the user to depress a release button, rack the heavy slide backward with significant force to eject, and push it forward to chamber a new round. Furthermore, to fire, the heavy trigger must be pulled. It requires absolute physical intent. The gun discharged. The deafening roar shattered the suburban quiet. A massive slug struck Seth directly in the chest at close range. The kinetic energy threw him backward. He bled out on the kitchen floor, the air instantly thick with the sharp smell of iron and burning powder. What followed was not the frantic, hysterical behavior of a sister who had just accidentally shot her beloved brother. Amy did not drop the weapon in shock. She did not drop to her knees and apply pressure to the catastrophic wound. She did not scream for an ambulance. She kept the shotgun, she turned, and fled out the back door. Amy ran through the suburban streets of Braintree, still clutching the 12-gauge. She moved with frantic, terrifying purpose. She approached a nearby auto dealership. An employee was locking up a vehicle in the lot. Amy leveled the shotgun directly at the man's face, aggressively demanding the keys to the car. The employee, staring down the barrel of a weapon that had ended a life minutes prior, managed to dive behind a concrete wall and flee for his life. Responding Braintree patrol officers converged on the dealership. They found the 21-year-old woman hiding behind a dumpster. They drew their service weapons, screaming commands for her to drop the shotgun. She eventually complied, mirroring the exact blank compliance she would exhibit 24 years later in Alabama. She was arrested, handcuffed, and transported in the back of a cruiser to the precinct. At this point in the 1986 timeline, a standard homicide investigation should have commenced. An 18-year-old man was dead. The primary suspect had fled the bloody scene with the murder weapon and attempted an armed, violent carjacking. The evidence for severe manslaughter and armed robbery was overwhelming, but the machinery of justice in Braintree violently stalled. Judy Bishop, grieving the horrific death of her son, immediately shifted into political preservation mode. She arrived at the police station. She bypassed standard protocol and demanded direct access to the chief of police, utilizing her heavy status on the town council. The exact nature of those closed-door conversations remains buried in history, but the outcome was an astonishing corruption of procedure. The chief ordered the booking process to be halted immediately. Amy was never photographed. She was never fingerprinted. She was quietly released through a back door directly into the custody of her mother. The Braintree police drafted a heavily sanitized report. They officially ruled the fatal discharge a tragic freak accident. They dismissed the armed carjacking attempt as a grief-induced panic attack. The district attorney's office eventually received the files, but they were glaringly, suspiciously incomplete. Essential initial reports were missing. Crime scene photos vanished. The physical evidence was severely mishandled. Without a comprehensive file, the state declined to press charges. The entire incident was quietly swept under the rug, buried beneath the political weight and social standing of the Bishop family. Amy returned to her university studies. She carried no criminal record. No psychological evaluations were ever mandated. The system explicitly validated her absolute lack of accountability. She learned a devastating psychological lesson in the winter of 1986. She could extinguish human life, point a loaded weapon at a stranger, and simply walk away, completely untouchable. Back in 2010, the Huntsville detectives sat at their desks, reviewing the newly unearthed 1986 files faxed over from Massachusetts. The realization was physically sickening. Dr. Gopi Padilla, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson were dead because a small-town police department had decided to look the other way. The UAH massacre was not a sudden, unpredictable psychological snap. It was the horrific, delayed echo of a murder that had been successfully covered up 24 years prior. The interrogation of Amy Bishop yielded nothing resembling a confession. Inside the stark concrete walls of the Huntsville police precinct, detectives encountered a psychological void. Murder suspects typically display a predictable spectrum of post-incident reactions: hysteria, catatonic shock, frantic justification, or profound remorse. Bishop displayed mild annoyance. She did not inquire about the survival of the colleagues she had shot. She did not ask about the catastrophic damage inflicted upon the biology department. Instead, she complained about the temperature of the holding cell. She spoke to the investigators with the exasperated tone of an academic forced to endure a tedious administrative hurdle. Her cognitive detachment was absolute. She framed the afternoon's carnage not as a massacre, but as a severe career dispute that had unfortunately escalated. She discussed the intricacies of her denied tenure application, referencing the automated cell incubator and her publication record as if the detectives were an appellate board reviewing her credentials. The sociopathic disconnect was terrifying. The authorities realized they were not dealing with a woman who had experienced a temporary psychotic break. They were looking at a highly functional predator whose narcissism completely overrode her capacity for human empathy. While Bishop sat unbothered in a cell, the social echo of her actions reverberated through Huntsville. Known as Rocket City for its deep ties to NASA and defense engineering, the community was a bastion of logic, reason, and scientific inquiry. The realization that a mass execution had occurred within the sanctuary of the Shelby Center fundamentally fractured that sense of security. The campus was cordoned off with miles of yellow crime scene tape. Students and faculty held candlelight vigils, grappling with a profound sense of betrayal. The university was supposed to be a meritocracy of ideas. Instead, it had become the hunting ground for an ego that refused to be contained. The psychological scars left on the survivors, the academics who had pressed makeshift tourniquets to the catastrophic head wounds of their friends, permanently altered the atmosphere of the institution. Investigators quickly shifted their crosshairs to the only other person in Bishop's insular world, her husband, James Anderson. Detectives hauled him in for extensive questioning. The timeline of the weapons acquisition placed him directly in the center of the conspiracy. Anderson admitted that he had purchased the 9mm Ruger pistol just weeks before the shooting. He confirmed that he had accompanied his wife to a local indoor firing range, standing beside her as she practiced her marksmanship. The interrogation grew intensely confrontational. Detectives demanded to know if Anderson was an active accomplice or the architect of the massacre. He vehemently denied any prior knowledge of the hit list. Anderson painted a grim picture of their domestic life, describing a household ruled entirely by his wife's volatile temperament. He claimed she had requested the firearm for personal protection, citing vague, paranoid fears about her safety. He positioned himself not as a co-conspirator, but as an enabling, beaten-down spouse who lacked the psychological fortitude to question her demands. While law enforcement viewed him as morally culpable for arming an obviously unstable woman, the evidence fell short of legally proving he had orchestrated the attack. He remained a free man, heavily insulated by plausible deniability. But as the Huntsville detectives continued to peel back the layers of Bishop's past, the 1986 Braintree shooting was not the only skeleton they unearthed. The federal databases flagged another massive, chilling red herring. The timeline shifted back to 1993. Years before arriving in Alabama, Bishop was working as a postdoctoral researcher at a Boston Children's Hospital, affiliated with Harvard Medical School. She found herself under the supervision of Dr. Paul Rosenberg. True to her established pattern, she was notoriously difficult to manage. She argued relentlessly, refused to accept direction, and openly defied laboratory protocols. Rosenberg eventually drafted a severely negative evaluation of her performance, effectively forcing her resignation. Weeks later, a package arrived at Rosenberg's suburban home. His wife opened it. Inside were two 6-inch galvanized steel pipes packed tightly with black powder and wired to a crude explosive mechanism. It was a functional, lethal pipe bomb. By sheer luck, the triggering mechanism failed to spark. The device did not detonate. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives descended on the Boston area, launching a massive domestic terrorism investigation. The ATF profilers quickly narrowed their focus. The bomb required sophisticated scientific knowledge to construct, and the target was highly specific. The suspect list immediately zeroed in on the disgruntled former researcher and her husband. Federal agents executed search warrants on the couple's residence. They discovered extensive literature regarding the construction of explosive devices. When interrogated, Anderson calmly explained that he was an aspiring author writing a thriller novel, and the bomb-making manuals were simply research materials for his manuscript. Bishop was equally uncooperative and combative. The ATF knew they had the right suspects. The profile was a perfect match. But the physical evidence, the lack of definitive fingerprints or DNA on the unexploded pipes, was insufficient to secure an indictment. The investigation hit a frustrating, impenetrable dead end. The case was closed without an arrest. Sitting in the Alabama precinct in 2010, the synthesis of these historical files hit the homicide detectives with sickening clarity. A terrifying, decades-long pattern materialized. In 1986, a perceived slight or familial argument culminated in a fatal shotgun blast. The system labeled it an accident. In 1993, a negative performance review culminated in a targeted explosive device. The system failed to prosecute. In 2010, a denied tenure application culminated in a systematic, point-blank execution of 3 department heads. The arrogance radiating from Amy Bishop in the interrogation room was not a delusion. It was a deeply ingrained, learned behavior. Every time she had utilized lethal violence to resolve a personal grievance, she had slipped through the cracks. The justice system had inadvertently trained her to believe she was a genius, operating entirely above the law. The Huntsville massacre was the horrific endpoint of a societal failure that had allowed a sociopath to hide behind a Harvard degree for 24 years. The legal reckoning for Amy Bishop was swift and aggressively unforgiving. Madison County prosecutors immediately pursued a capital murder conviction, seeking the ultimate penalty. For 2 years, her defense team maneuvered through procedural delays, desperate to save her from death row. But the sheer magnitude of the physical evidence and the dozens of surviving eyewitnesses made an insanity defense impossible to sustain. In September 2012, facing the undeniable reality of a lethal injection, the arrogance finally fractured. Bishop entered a guilty plea for 3 counts of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. The judge handed down a definitive sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Simultaneously, a massive legal shift occurred 1,100 miles north. Armed with the irrefutable proof of her violent pathology, a Massachusetts grand jury officially reopened the Braintree files. After a quarter-century of silence, Bishop was formally indicted for the first-degree murder of her brother. However, since Alabama had already locked her away in a maximum security cell for the rest of her natural life, Northern prosecutors ultimately declined to extradite her for a secondary trial. The indictment served purely as a historical correction, a delayed, paper-bound acknowledgement of a heavily protected homicide. The Shelby Center stands today as a quiet monument to an unimaginable breach of trust. Universities operate on the presumption of shared intellect and rational thought, but a brilliant mind does not preclude a predator. Amy Bishop weaponized her academic pedigree to shield a deeply embedded capacity for lethal violence. She demanded the world recognize her as a visionary. Instead, locked away in an Alabama penitentiary, she is only remembered as the architect of her own devastating hubris. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.